And thank you, Christine, for the early introduction for the whole workshop. Yeah, it's really lovely to see familiar faces and also some new names and faces on the screen. Yeah, so I have written a paper on two Sri Lankan political economists named S.B.D. de Silva and G.V.S. de Silva. So I will probably refer to these people as S.B.D. and G.V.S., the two de Silvas. As Christine said, it was a real pleasure to work with the group that we set up, to do a set of readings on Marxism in South Asia over roughly about an year, if not more. And towards the end of it, we also, circulated our writings, in preparation for this conference, and the participants of this reading group had an opportunity to read and comment on each other's papers. So I have shared my paper with this group or that core group of that was participating in the proceedings that Christine described. And Wakas, who's going to comment on both my paper and Ayaz's paper in this session, has already seen what I've written. So I'm not going to actually try to read exactly the paper, that would be a bit too boring and too long anyway. So I will try to do, since I'm doing the first session anyway, first presentation anyway, I will try to do this a little bit more informally and in a general way that might be of broader interest, even if you are not particularly, concerned about these two particular political economists. And the reason I thought I would do it this way, because after I prepared this paper and also the presentation in sometime in April, which had to be, of course, postponed because of the censure, the CAUT censure of U of T. Since then, I had been asked to write another paper by Marcelo Musto and Ammaini Babak, two writers, who are researching the reception of Marx's writings, especially Capital, around the world. So they have this massive project surveying how Marx was read, in different countries of the world, and how Marx's texts were translated, published, received, and so on, and how they also, of course, related to left politics in various places. So it is a massive project, and I ended up writing one of the 50 or so chapters, right, in that book. And so I was asked specifically to write on Sri Lanka, right? So this gave me an opportunity to kind of reflect a little bit more broadly on how Sri Lankans encountered Marx, Marx's writings. And so this gave me the challenge of trying to kind of, over the last nearly 100 years, to understand how in this kind of time frame, Sri Lanka, Marxism as a political movement, grew and developed in Sri Lanka, and how they also actually, read Marx, right? So I will try to say a little bit about that paper. Because I thought it would be of broader interest, and then try to locate, these two particular political economists within that overall sort of picture that I would like to sketch very briefly today. So this is sort of how I start my that paper. So the relationship between Sri Lankan Marxists and Karl Marx's writings, including Capital, divides into three phases. In the first one, their formative engagement with communist internationalism in the 1920s, from the 1920s to the achievement of some post-colonial parliamentary political power, by 1956. So 1920s to 56, roughly the first phase, in this phase, the relationship between these Marxists and Marx's own writings was virtually non-existent at the level of mass politics, right? So this does not mean, of course, that these the Sri Lankan Marxists, especially the leaders of the Marxist movement and political parties, didn't know about Marx, but at the level of mass politics, at the level of broad, popular awareness in left circles, Marx's writings were hardly a factor, right? So the pertinent question for this period, from the late 20s to 56, is not how Sri Lankans read capital, but why they did not. And this requires minimal background on the national and international circumstances of the origin and development of the Marxist movement in Sri Lanka. The second period goes from 1956 to 1977, which is the heyday of Sri Lanka's pursuit of national development, in the post-colonial national development, during which time leaders of Marxist parties even occupied a few key ministerial positions in several leftist coalition governments from 56 to 77. It was in these years that Marxist literature became available for the masses in English, Sinhala, and Tamil, although Marx's own writings in this impressive left literary production and circulation still remain a relatively small fraction. Compared to, say, the writings of Lenin, Mao, and some other 20th century leaders of revolutionary movements and Marxist states and governments. And the ongoing third phase can be dated from 1977, which is the beginning of neoliberalism in Sri Lanka and the demise of Marxist political parties as effective political forces within or outside of parliament. So it is mostly in this post-1977 period, after the virtual elimination of Marxist parties from electoral politics, that substantive readings of Capital and related texts, such as Grund, were pursued by Sri Lankan Marxists in various attempts to make sense of the country's history and politics. The presence as well as the absence of Marx in Sri Lankan Marxism, therefore, requires some historical perspective, right? So I would basically sort of say that in the beginning, for the mass politics, Marx's writings didn't quite really matter, and there's a reason for this. So Marxism as a political force, organized political movement, came into being in the 1930s in Sri Lanka, right? So the leaders of this movement were actually, all came from the upper classes, right? Nearly without exception, and they were mostly educated in London, and in some places, in one important case, the Philip Goonewardena, who was sometimes considered to be the father of Marxism, in Sri Lanka, was actually educated in the US before he went to also to London. So in London, these a very prodigious and cosmopolitan group of students from Sri Lanka became radicalized, and they got really involved, centrally involved in the politics of the Communist Party of Great Britain, for example, and even beyond that, became very active in the Comintern politics, right? The politics of the Communist International, right? And not as like, secondary sort of, kind of people who were junior partners, in this kind of circuits, but as central participants. And they were, they also got in touch during these years with other anti-colonial revolutionary minded people from other countries, other parts of the world, especially from Africa and places like India, especially, right? And at this time, of course, India and Pakistan were not divided the way it is now, right? And so they came back to Sri Lanka after finishing their studies, like in the early 30s, from the late 20s to early 30s, and they intervened and organized in a new way, and already sort of brewing, anti-colonial kind of a movement, which in Sri Lanka was, one has to say that for the whole, the mainstream or the mainstream current of anti-colonial politics was not that radical, in the sense that, given the particular class structure, the landowning agrarian class, that was sort of at the head, of this anti-colonial, were leading the anti-colonial movement in some way, were like pretty happy with the, kind of getting a little bit more autonomy and power for themselves, under the colonial dispensation, but was not really agitating for, full independence, right? So it is the Marxists, say the leftists, who came back, radicalized, to kind of took the anti-colonial movement in a radical direction, and at the same time organized the fledgling, labor movement, in the country, moved it from a liberal, laborist kind of a orientation to a more radical socialist and revolutionary oriented, to a revolutionary movement, right? And so all of this was done with the by setting up the first Marxist party in 1935, which were, because of the nature of the people and the way they were radicalized in the Comintern movement and in the Comintern debates, this party, soon assumed a Trotskyist, line, right? And then there was a split from it in the early 40s, and in 1943, a Communist Party of Ceylon, as it was called then, was formed. And they, so together, this LSSP, Lanka Samasamaja Party, or, Lanka Socialist Party, basically it means, and the Communist Party, they contested the first elections, when as Sri Lanka became independent, and collectively were able to get about 1/3 of the vote, right, the popular vote, right? And so since then they have remained a very, for the next 3 decades or so, from 48 independence until 1977, were a formidable political force in parliament, right? So there was a coalition government from 56 to in 56 and early 60s, and also in 1970, and so these were sort of more the high moments, of these left parties, when people were some Trotskyites were even, and communists were became even key ministers, so the finance minister, in the 1977 government was a communist, like a Trotskyite, who studied in the London School of Economics with people like Harold Lasky and so on, right? So so to cut a very long story short, so my time, I'm looking at the time, it's already close to 15 minutes, so so in the political, so although they were the kind of, communists and revolutionaries, they've sort of, by 56, they had firmly kind of decided to enter the parliament, so thought of a parliamentary road to socialism, more or less, right? And so were participating in the National Development Project, but with some successes. But then, this strategy basically came to an end in 1977, with the defeat, of the left parties and the kind of the rise of neoliberalism. And so after 1977, left parties were really not a significant factor anymore, right? So the writings that I'm talking about, which I can't obviously go into any detail in a short presentation like this, but they were basically like trying to understand what happened. Okay, so why did the left strategy of development fail in Sri Lanka, right? And what could have happened? What could have been done differently? And so on. So S.B.D. de Silva's book, The Political Economy of Underdevelopment, takes a long historical perspective on the nature of the Sri Lankan economy. How it was transformed during colonial times by establishing plantations and a particular structure, a dynamic of underdevelopment, which prevented rather than encouraged industrialization and the development of productive forces and so on, right? So there's a kind of a systemic, structural kind of political economic analysis in S.B.D. de Silva's book, The Political Economy of Underdevelopment, right? Which kind of prepares some groundwork for understanding why the left political agenda of both the communists and the Trotskyists didn't really work according to expectations. And G.V.S. de Silva, also a very important political economist, and probably, in my view, perhaps the most original, and innovative reader of Marx and Marxist thought in Sri Lanka. So he was also and the author of, one of his books is sort of collected in this collection called Socialism or Barbarism, so I've written about one of these essays, especially in the paper that I circulated earlier to our group. But so he presented a strategy, of development, centered on, agricultural development, peasant politics, and the development of, again, like S.B.D. de Silva, he was concerned with the development of productive forces, but also development of political relations, establishing democratic forms of governance, self-determination at the level of, districts and villages, and popular participation, in the development project. So there was a kind of a vision that I think is a certain kind of adaptation of Lenin's definition of communism as electrification plus Soviet power, right? And so development of productive forces plus the development of political forms, but in G.V.S. de Silva's case, he argued that, we really need to concentrate our efforts. I mean, he wrote this in the 70s, in the peasant sector, in the villages, right? And that we have to put a stop to the drain of resources from the villages to the big cities, and from the big cities to the global metropoles, right? So there's a kind of a global anti-imperialist critique was also very much part of this perspective of G.V.S. de Silva. So so I think, my 20 minutes are more or less up. I can get into details and so on if people are interested. But so in sum, this is what I would like to say. So again, to kind of read just from the last chapter of last paragraph rather of my the paper that I wrote on the sort of, how Sri Lankans encountered and read Marx, So we have these, three phases. The first phase, I call, Marxism without Marx, right? And the second phase, we read a lot of Marx, particularly coming from the Soviet books and translations, and but it was more about like Lenin, the Comintern debates, and problems of national self-determination and so on and so forth. Marx played a role, not that much, in that 1956 to 77 phase, but from 77 onwards, ironically, it was after the left project kind of, basically failed, as far as these communist and the old left party, LSSP and the CP and these parties are concerned. And it was ironically after the end of their influence that a number of Marxists, who were sympathetic towards and, in many ways associated with those parties, really kind of read Marx in a analytical, scholarly, serious kind of way, to understand the particularities of the Sri Lankan experience, to make sense of what happened, what could have happened, and so on, right? And so now we are kind of in this situation where more people are interested in reading Marx and kind of, doing more critical work. But what is not accompanying them is like a political, organization and a movement, or a series of movements to make a real practical political intervention. And this, I think, is the great challenge, now confronting the Marxists in Sri Lanka and perhaps elsewhere as well. So I will stop there.